It occurs to me of late, as I have been receiving no small degree of, I believe the colloquial term is shade, from the residents of this quaint little waterside town, that I don't think many of you are actually familiar with the city of Innsmouth. Well, perhaps it's the simmering rage talking, but let's do something special tonight. We're going to feature 2 chapters of Spores, and I'm going to spill a little tea about this grumpy little hamlet. If they're going to make me feel unwelcome, I suppose it's only right that I give them a reason to grouse. Strap in, listeners. This is going to be a hell of a ride. Hello, listeners. My name is Jonas Armitage, and you're listening to Stories from Dark Places. For the sake of my station manager, who has already begun to receive phone calls from concerned citizens, we're going to jump right into the evening's events. May I present Chapter 7 of Spores by Creepimonkeiboi.
My name is Hugh Aronset. I am the 11th President of the Nation of Israel, husband of 33 years, father to 5 children, and I pray that history will judge me mercifully for finishing what began 70 years ago. The plague had subtle beginnings, but like a wildfire left unattended, it quickly grew beyond our expectations, and then our ability to control it, and then our fears. I believe they recently dubbed it the Shrike disease. Shrike is an ancient Latin word. It means butcher. I feel that they undersold it. The plague began somewhere in the mountains of Turkey, near the Georgia border. They linked it to the landfall of a meteorite, some type of organism that was birthed in the stars. The idea that life exists outside of our small planet is overwhelming. The thought that there is more of this thing out in the cosmos, terrifying. The organism made a solid beachhead on our world and began its attack. The Turkish government, not wanting to appear weak, tried to hide its existence while blasting their own lands and people with the flame of their military, not understanding the organism had already spread into and was ravaging any nearby country that they did not want to show weakness to. The world might have stopped it then, if they had heeded the warning signs with a concerted effort. Animal extermination, mass treatment of the infected, burning the land that was already lost. But I am not one to cast stones, as I too ignore them. They are Turkish problems. It is a Georgian disease. We said these things as flocks of birds and insects were spreading the wildfire under our noses. My country has the unique disposition to manage this type of threat better than others. Israel always faces extinction, surrounded at all times by hostile countries that will and have tried to wipe us from the planet. The Germans made a valiant effort to accomplish this. As the countries around us collapsed, their cities burning, their people hiding in whatever shelter they could find, the United States was reeling from their own infections that mysteriously blossomed across their vast land. We, people of God, we had enacted our own policies, aggressive and admittedly brutal treatment of infected people. We burned livestock at the first sign of infection. We met refugees at the border with flamethrowers, and our people bore this with stoicism and acceptance. To do otherwise was death, and we knew it. We had accepted this 70 years ago when they loaded us onto trains at gunpoint and took us to the chambers. To compromise, to acquiesce was to perish from the earth. We treated tens of thousands of people. Those that could be saved were, By removing limb or flesh, we delayed the spread of the plague. Those that could not be saved were humanely ended. Not once did I hear of a person protest when the doctors told them they must die to protect the rest. Not once. It is our way. But it was working. While France and Germany were executing protesters in the streets for breaking curfew, while the president of Russia was dying in his bed, my people were walking freely in the streets. What we could not control were the storms, the great dark clouds of Shrike spores that blew across the lands like dust storms. We didn't know. Overnight, our infection rates went from a manageable tens of thousands to millions. We simply did not have the resources to save ourselves, and there was no one left to help us. Within a week, our people went from walking freely and openly in the streets to dying in them. My wife and all 5 of my beautiful babies with them. We are a proud people. We have suffered slavery and war and genocide, and I would not see us ended by this Shadim, this Mavet. My countrymen have stockpiled for many years the greatest weapon of mankind, weapons with the power of God to split the very atoms. I ordered them spread across our country, and in one moment, I will purge our lands of this demon and end the suffering of all of my people. I ended the task the Nazis and the Muslim and now the Shrike set out to do. God will judge my actions and hopefully find them holy and justified. I pray this will be true. I am Hugh Arinset, father, husband, Hebrew, soldier, and destroyer of Israel. And I am truly sorry for what I have just done.
I'm going to make a public apology to my station manager now, who has received over 100 calls so far demanding I not say a bloody word about this irritating little town. Apparently the people prefer their privacy. In response, I say let's talk a little about the city's history. Innsmouth, a coastal town. Not that you'll see anything bigger than a tugboat down at the docks. On the coast of Essex County, between Plum Island and Cape Ann. It's a small community, less than 1,000 residents, and I wouldn't call it picturesque. More like Trevor Henderson's take on American Gothic. The architecture is quite old and not in the finest state of repair, often held up only by the eternal stamina of its brick and mortar. It receives a steady flow of brisk sea air, but the chimney pots provide the city with a sooty din most evenings. The waterfront especially, with its aged and creaking piers and wharves that appear moments from collapsing into the sea, are the most lively area of town due to the booming fisherman's economy. The most well-repaired buildings are Marsh Hall, the Masonic enclave named after local sea captain and hero Obed Marsh, and the WZHP broadcast station. Established over 100 years before the American Revolution, Innsmouth was a respectable industry town known for its shipbuilders. Following the War of 1812, the town almost died out, but for Obed Marsh, who returned from a trip to Oceania with a ship's hold full of gold. The following year, he commissioned the building of the Masonic Hall that bears his name, and the following year, the town experienced a prolific upsurge in the fish population, and this allowed Innsmouth to become an essential exporter to the surrounding townships. And then came the plague of 1846, which resulted in a massive drop in the fish population and an economic crash within the town. People were starving in the streets, and businesses could not acquire the goods necessary to keep themselves open. The town turned to the Marsh family again at that point, who converted the recently abandoned Carter fishery into a massive distillery. The Masonic Order also pledged its support and brought Innsmouth to a shaky state of survival. In 1920, when the Massachusetts jumped onto the Prohibition Bill, Marsh brought his business underground into the smugglers' caverns that honeycombed the coast and continued to run a massive bootlegging operation out of the Masonic Hall. In 1927, a combined force of federal agents and Pinkerton agents descended on the town, breaking up Marsh's rum-running operation and arresting a large part of the Masonic Order. The residents of the town retaliated, assaulting agents and fighting against the representatives of the U.S. government that they felt had no place to interfere with their business. Appropriate. The conflict lasted well into 1928, when the National Guard finally were called to step in. Explosives were detonated across Devil's Reap and into the caves along Essex Bay, destroying the tunnels that the town's residents were using to stage their attacks, and setting a large portion of the town ablaze as secret caches of alcohol erupted into blazing, uncontrollable fires. Reports are difficult to find about the aftermath. Some say the aggressors died in the fire and the federal agents departed, while others say the entire population of the town was arrested, although no record of such events exists. Did the town's residents disappear into a secret government jail that does not officially exist? We'll talk more after Chapter 8 of Spores, coming up next. Brent leaned back in his chair and gave a speculative look to his Secretary of Defense, Hugh Frakes. After a moment, he waved his hand dismissively in the air in front of him.
"Just tell the Russians that the Triumph will be pulled back by tonight,"
he said. Hugh scribbled something down onto a pad of paper, tore the top page off, and handed it to a waiting aide behind him.
"Brett, I believe they're going to want the subs out as well. The Peruvians have been edgy the last few weeks. This pandemic in China's got them seeing spooks." "Then let them ask for that. They stand on station until then,"
Brett answered.
"What about our World Health inspectors? Have they gotten a report back yet?"
Another man at the table spoke up. "Sir, we haven't been able to contact them in Kuwait since Wednesday. Last reports were disturbing, to say the least."
"What are we looking at here, Tim?"
the Prime Minister asked him. Tim adjusted his glasses and looked at the report in his hand. "Our team reports that it is a parasitic fungal-type organism, possibly not terrestrial in origin, extremely dangerous and infectious across multiple species. But so far they've seen it spread by avian, mammal, and insect vectors." Timothy paused at this and looked up, expecting someone to interject. When no one did, he looked back down and continued. "Incubation period is virtually non-existent. Once infected, a diseased organism will start spreading the infection within 24 hours. Infected generally remain completely viable for 1 to 2 weeks before succumbing. Insect vectors even longer, as they don't suffer lung infections."
"What do the Chinese have to say about their own spread?"
Brent asked. "We haven't gotten a response back since last week. They're strangely quiet. No media in or out either."
"And the Americans? Do they have input?"
Timothy leaned back and received a piece of paper from his own aide behind him. He took a moment to review it. "Washington is reporting minor outbreaks in Chicago, New York City, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Spread patterns atypical from what we've seen. They're looking at it as a terrorist action. I should mention that Paris just sent over a communique that they're starting to see infected wildlife in the south near the coast."
"And how are our potential response options?"
Hugh inquired. "We've got 2-month stockpile of antibiotics and antifungals, and are distributing them to major medical centers. London metro area is fully stocked. We're pretty confident that we can manage an outbreak. We've enacted screening procedures on all incoming flights and shipping from infected regions. We've been successful at catching people trying to sneak through thus far." Brent shook his head in agreement.
"All right then, Matthew. How are we looking on finances? What kind of a hit are we going to take from this?"
Matthew Fenbender, chief finance advisor for the Prime Minister, started passing out documents to the table that had just opened his mouth to speak when he was interrupted by a Royal Navy admiral that approached the table. "Mr. Smithson, we've just gotten word that the captain of the Defender stopped 2 small container ships, the Young and the Hammerfell. both bearing South African flags, streaming towards the coast near Plymouth.
All right, dock them and have them run through the screening process,
Brent said. Sir, the Admiral paused briefly while he considered how to approach the topic. The ships were loaded with hundreds of infected refugees, mostly deceased. The Young and the Hammerfell were sunk at sea. Several sailors are undergoing decontamination, sir. All the motor launches from Young were missing. They think some of the passengers fled the boat once they made sight of land.
Let's have some security sweeps focusing the area around these people up. Go ahead and release a warning bulletin to the residents there to avoid conflict with anyone they might feel to be non-local. Sorry, Matthew. Go ahead with what you were saying.
My parents came to Innsmouth in 1974. They were recent graduates of Miskatonic, Hudson and Clare Armitage, and had never heard of the town. But there were numerous real estate flyers advertising